Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Stevenson Lecture at the University of Glasgow. I'm Christopher Carman. I'm the Stevenson Professor of Citizenship here at the university. The Stevenson Trust was established in 1921 with Sir Daniel Stevenson's generous gift to the university. Tied to this gift was the charge that we impart provide for the education of the people of Glasgow on matters of citizenship. And we take these lectures as one of the ways in which we seek to fulfill that remit. Fortunately, with the miracle of Zoom, we can go beyond Glasgow. And so welcome to those who are watching or attending virtually. Tonight's lecture speaks directly to some of the fundamental principles of citizenship in an active democracy. Texts, both modern and classical, tell us that citizenship involves both rights and responsibilities. Amongst these are the right to express one's views and the responsibility to participate in public life of the polity. But how far do these rights and responsibilities extend when one is subjected to intimidation, abuse, perhaps even violence, for being active participants in public life and trying to serve their communities as elected officials? Not only does the Jo Cox Foundation's Civility Commission report catalog the shocking abuse and threats directed at elected officials and their families, but more importantly, this work also provides potential solutions for the problem of increasing uncivil discourse and uncivil actions directed at our public servants. And we very much appreciate Moore and Hannah Phillips for joining us tonight to discuss the Foundation's call to action. Before I turn to introducing our speakers, I'll first note that we are recording tonight's event and we'll make it available on our website as soon as we are able. So if you participate and ask a question, we assume that amounts to consent for being included in the recording. Our website offers a trove of previous lectures, and we invite you to take a look at them, especially if you are an educator. And you can find us by Googling Stevenson Trust, University of Glasgow. So on to our speakers. Moore has been CEO of the Jo Cox Foundation since early 2021, having originally joined the team in 2019 as the Great Get Together campaign director. She has a varied background, including jobs in arts, charities, media, and sports, with organizations including London 2012, the British Council, and GB Snowsport. Outside the foundation, she is a trustee of the Bishopsgate Institute. Hannah Phillips has worked with the Jo Cox Foundation since the summer of 2023. She is a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford, where she studies violence and abuse in politics. Originally from Glasgow, she has worked on local, national, and international levels, including the London Borough of Lambeth Council, the UK House of Commons, and the United Nations. She is a trustee of the Rights of Women. So welcome home, Hannah, and welcome to Glasgow, Sue. And with that, I'll turn the microphone over to Sue and Hannah, and then I will return to chair the Q&A following the lecture. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for inviting us to be here. And thank you for all of you for coming. For Hannah, obviously, this is a homecoming, so we're delighted to be here today. And this is brilliant timing for us because we launched our call to action just 2 weeks ago. So this is really hot off the press. So we're thrilled to be talking about this issue. So today we'll talk to you about the issue of abuse and intimidation of elected politicians. We'll talk about why it's a problem. We'll tell you about some of the recommendations and solutions that we've put forward through our Civility Commission. And then we're going to leave plenty of time for questions because we're really interested in hearing your thoughts on what we're saying. Before, though, we start talking about the Civility Commission, I want to tell you a bit about Jo Cox and the Jo Cox Foundation. Now, in terms of about Jo Cox, I'm sure it's her name that brought most of you here today, so there is much that you already know about her. Jo was a Yorkshire lass, a proud Yorkshire lass. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, a wife. She was a humanitarian, For most of her career before she entered politics, she worked for organisations like Oxfam because she was really keen on helping the most vulnerable around the world. And then in 2015, when she heard that the MP for her home constituency, Batley and Spen, was retiring, she thought that was her time to move into politics. She had always wanted to represent her home constituency. And in the short time that she was an MP, she really continued to champion the cause of those people who were most vulnerable. She was an advocate for humanitarian intervention in Syria. And she also did a lot to highlight the problem of loneliness in the UK. She'd first found out about the issue of loneliness really when she was kind of pounding the pavements in Batley and Spen and talking to people who she realized that they didn't necessarily actually want to vote for her. They just hadn't spoken to somebody for the whole week. So she launched a cross-party commission when she was in Parliament to try and find ways to address that issue of loneliness. Now, the one thing that I'm sure that you all know about Jo is that in June of 2016, when she was on her way to meet constituents, she was murdered. And the Jo Cox Foundation was set up in the months following her murder by her friends and family who just really wanted something positive to come from that terrible tragedy of her death. We are a very small organisation. There are only 15 of us, and we're headquartered in Batley and Spen, which of course was Jo's constituency. And we work to make positive change on issues that Jo was passionate about. So we work in three main ways. We work to build stronger communities. So this centres our work around community cohesion. As Chris said, I started at the foundation as the Great Get Together campaign director. You may have heard of the Great Get Together. It's our community building initiative that we do every June on the weekend that was closest to Jo's birthday. And we ask people to come together with their communities, people they know, but hopefully also people they don't, to celebrate Jo's words that she spoke in her first speech in Parliament, that we have more in common than that which divides us. And it's here in our community's work that we also continue to centre Jo's crusade on loneliness and push for continued government action on that issue. We work in a fairer world. So this is our international stream of work. And that's principally done through a grant collaboration with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where we have grants across the world on issues including women's empowerment and prevention of identity-based violence, issues that were so close to Jo's heart. And our third work stream, and the thing that brings us here today, is respectful politics. So as well as the Civility Commission, previous work that we've done in this area includes a civility pledge that we do at each local and national election, where we ask candidates to sign up to this pledge to say that they will run a respectful campaign. Now, I just wanted to reflect before I pass to Hannah about the reason why we do this work. And actually, the reason why we work in respectful politics is not because of the way that Jo died. It's because of the way that she lived. And one of the things that she was really passionate about was representative democracy and empowering other women to get involved in politics. She was a very, very strong advocate for a 50-50 parliament, so a 50-50 gender split, and she really supported other women. Now, we know this issue of abuse and intimidation disproportionately impacts women, and so we think that we can't make real change on that issue without tackling the very difficult issue of abuse and intimidation. So our plucky team of 15 have decided that we will do our best to try and find solutions to this really difficult issue. And that's why we formed the Jo Cox Civility Commission.
Great, thanks, Sue, and thanks, Chris, for inviting us and for the homecoming, the welcome home for me. It is really great to be in Glasgow to talk about this issue. So, launched in February last year, the Jo Cox Civility Commission has developed practical recommendations to address this problem of violence, abuse, intimidation of elected representatives on national and local levels across all the nations and regions in the UK. The recommendations are ambitious and practical. There are some quick wins that support work that's already ongoing, and some that will take a bit longer and require larger change. And so we've written the recommendations, but that was the easy part. Now we aim to monitor and push for the implementation of our call to action. And this year, with a general election coming up and other elections around the UK, it's more important than ever that we work to create a political culture of respect where violence is not tolerated. And as Sue said, all of the Foundation's work, and particularly the Civility Commission, is centred around Jo's values, that we are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us, which is a quote that is from her maiden speech in Parliament. So I want to talk to you about why this is such a problem and what the problem of violence and abuse in politics looks like. So one of the first aspects of the problem is that abuse has become worse in recent years. A lot of evidence indicates that prevalence of all types of abuse in politics has gone up. And something that's really important and alarming is that it seems to be quite a normalized part of the job. A lot of the people we spoke to, MPs, former MPs, local councillors, talked about how abuse was just kind of an expected part of their jobs now. For elected representatives and their staff, trolling through death threats on emails and Twitter is just kind of part of their day-to-day now. In a poignant letter to her constituents when standing down in 2019, Heidi Allen wrote, "Nobody in any job should have to put up with threats, aggressive emails, being shouted at in the street, sworn at on social media, nor have to install panic alarms at home." And her and others have stood down partly because of the abuse that they face on a day-to-day basis. So that's something that other research and our research has shown, that abuse has become worse and is somewhat kind of normalized as part of the job of an elected representative. Another part of the problem is that abuse can take a range of forms. So a lot of people might assume that it's just an online problem, that, you know, it's about abusive tweets, maybe emails, and that is an incredibly important part of the problem. But a lot of people experience kind of regular in-person harassment as well. And of course, as we know all too well, 2 MPs, Jo Cox and Sir David Amess, have been murdered in the last 8 years. So there's a really kind of spectrum of different forms of abuse and violence that elected representatives face regularly. Abuse is often heightened in response to certain issues. So quite often a controversial foreign policy vote in Parliament will be preceded and afterwards by a spike in abuse and violence. On a local level, nearly every elected representative we spoke to talked about how planning, like a council meeting that talked about a particular planning decision, controversial planning decision, they knew they were going to get abused before and after, often in the meeting physically. So that's kind of something we wanted to really kind of emphasize, that this isn't just an online problem, though that is something that's incredibly important. In a particular shocking submission, a local councillor told us, "I've had a swastika painted on my wall, the words traitor painted on my wall, campaign posters defaced and destroyed, tires slashed and threatened of being egged on the street." Other councillors told us they had been their house had been firebombed, that they had people come up to them in the street. And something that's important as well about the abuse faced by elected representatives is it's not just them, it impacts their staff and it impacts their families. Often, particularly if there's abuse targeted to the home, it's the family that might be home when that's happening. An MP's wife shared that she was home when a special package was delivered that was human feces, and she was the one that came directly to her home. So this kind of abuse is impactful, not just to the elected representatives, but to their staff and their families. And as I've mentioned, abuse is experienced by those serving at all levels in government. And we thought it was really important not just to include MPs, but to include those serving councillors, parish councillors, those in local authorities, police and crime commissioners, as well as members of Parliament, members of Scottish Parliament, members of the Welsh and Northern Ireland Assemblies as well. And the Local Government Association, as well as the National Association of Local Councils, have been really important partners with us on this issue and have campaigned on this issue for some time. And a kind of important stat is the Local Government Association's Debate Not Hate research, which I'd really recommend you looking up if you're interested in this issue. They found that 60% of councillors were aware of other councillors being unwilling to stand or restand for election due to anticipated abuse, and that 7 out of 10 local councillors had experienced abuse and intimidation. So just to reiterate that this is a problem experienced by those serving at all levels in government. And as Sue mentioned, this issue does have although it can affect and does affect people of all sorts of identities, there is evidence of a disproportionate impact on some groups, particularly women and those with other protective characteristics. Here in Scotland, Hollywood Magazine revealed that 70% of members of Scottish Parliament said that they had feared for their safety since being elected, and that figure rose to almost 90% of female MSPs. There's been a lot of other research on this. So, for example, ahead of the 2017 general election, Amnesty International found that the 20 minority ethnic women MPs received almost half of all the abuse directed towards just women MPs. So that shows the kind of intersecting problem of this issue. And if another example, there are many examples, and I'm sure you've seen some of them in the news, is that the it impacts women and other those with other protected characteristics, particularly the kind of form of abuse. So women tend to get more sexualized abuse, for example, rape threats. And Jess Phillips MP has shared that she once received 600 rape threats in one single evening. So just to reiterate that this does affect kind of certain groups particularly. And so why should we care about this issue? I mean, hopefully you should care about this issue, anyway, but we join others in arguing that this issue is not just important because it impacts those serving, it impacts individuals and groups, but it also impacts and threatens democracy. There is lots of evidence and emerging evidence that shows that the prevalence of abuse puts people off standing for election. And that means that pipeline of people coming in will lessen and there'll be less diverse representation. And several MPs, as I mentioned, are not standing for election partly because of abuse. Mary Black in Scotland has said she's standing down partly due to abuse. Just last week, Michael Freer said he is standing down due to death threats. And as I mentioned, the pipeline, research by Girl Guiding UK shows that the issue of online abuse in particular is shaping the career choices of girls and young women, with more than a third put off from certain jobs, including politics, because of the abuse high-profile women get online. So I hope in that kind of brief overview, I've showed you that this problem is a serious one. It is one that has become worse and even normalized in recent years. It takes a range of forms and impacts those at all levels of government, with a disproportionate impact in some groups. And importantly, it threatens democracy, which is why we think it's so important that we tackle this issue now. There has been action in recent years by various stakeholders. For example, the Independent Committee on Standards in Public Life published a report in 2017 about intimidation towards elected representatives. In 2015, Operation Bridger, which is a national security plan for MPs, was established. And after Jo Cox's murder in 2016, it was expanded. And so there has been a lot of fantastic people that we worked with that are doing a lot of great work on this issue. However, they told us, and our evidence suggests that further action is needed, which is why we have this lovely call to action that a lot of you have in your hands. One of the issues, and Sue will talk more about this when she goes through the recommendations, but is that there are police in different areas may interpret the problem differently. So some people have fantastic experiences with the police forces in the areas, but for example, local councillors don't always know where to go when they're experiencing abuse. Do they go to their council, the police? So there's some action that is still needed to improve that coordination. And before I hand back over to Sue, I want to share some hope because I've talked a lot about how bad things are. So someone, when we had launched the commission a couple of weeks ago, emailed our commission email address and shared experiences of pretty horrific abuse, but then at the end said, "Keep up the good work. I felt I was alone facing this, but now I know I'm not." So I'll pass back over to Sue to talk about the recommendations.
Thanks, Hannah. And I want to start back again on that message of hope. Like, as Hannah's outlined, it's quite bleak. There is a lot of damage happening, but we do think that there are solutions that we can put in place that are going to make a difference on this issue. And that's why we've taken on this work. So in terms of the process for our commission, we were absolutely sure that it had to be a collaborative process. Like, we know that we as the Jo Cox Foundation don't have all of the answers. And actually we were sort of put into action on this when we spoke to a staff member of an MP who came to us with a 5-point plan for what he thought would make change on this issue. So we really realized that it's those people with lived experience who actually can help us find solutions. So over the last 10 months, we've engaged with almost 150 stakeholders, and those have been people with lived experience and also expert organizations. So we had an open call on our website and we had about 100 submissions to that. Almost all of those were actually local councillors. So some of those gave us those instances of their own experiences that Hannah outlined, but they also came up with solutions that we've incorporated into our work. We worked with experts as well. I'm not going to go through all of these logos, but just to give you a sense of who we worked with, Hannah's mentioned the Local Government Association, who were brilliant partners. The Electoral Commission have been fabulous, actually. They, as you might imagine, are the people responsible for elections in the UK, but they're also responsible for other things that have been helpful. For example, registering of political parties, which I hadn't realised previously was in their remit. People like Fawcett and Centenary Action are organisations and charities who work for sort of gender empowerment and 50-50 Parliament. And another really great partner on there is Shout Out UK, who deal with political literacy. And you will hear far more on political literacy before we are finished for this evening. It's also important to say that we've done UK-wide engagement. For us, it was really important that this was a UK-wide project, and we've spoken to lots of very, very helpful colleagues in Scotland. So it's great to be here today. Now, for those of you who've already picked up a copy of the report, you will see that we have 28 recommendations. It was more than that. I think at one point it was possibly 75 recommendations, but it has been key for us in this work that they need to be implementable and practical recommendations. So 28 is where we settled, and we've themed them according to these themes. And I'm not going to talk through every single one of the 28 recommendations, because I'm sure you have plenty of places that you would rather be than listening to me go through them one by one. But I'll give you some ideas of the kind of things that we've pulled out as being important. Those first two, coordination of behaviour and political literacy, I'm going to come back to on the next slide. So let's park those ones for now. The next one on here is social media. I think this is really interesting, because if you'd asked me in February of last year, what's going to be the main theme that comes out of this, I would have said it would be social media. And I don't want to do down the importance of social media, because it is still a really important theme, but it probably wasn't that one cross-cutting thing that came across in our interviews. That said, we are not letting the social media companies off the hook, and there is definitely a role for them to play. One of the things that we've been watching closely is the progress of the Online Safety Bill, now the Online Safety Act. It's been a bit tortuous. I can imagine that you possibly haven't all looked at it in detail, but it finally became law in December. And this is a law about protecting users of social media in the UK. Now, we are calling on Ofcom, who are the regulator for the Social Media Act, to deal with elected politicians as a particular category because of the impact that abuse of them has on democracy. And we've had really good feedback so far from Ofcom about how happy they are to work with us on that. We also make suggestions, for example, for social media companies to extend the support they currently give to MPs to local councillors. Local councillors, as Hannah said, quite often feel alone. If they get abuse, they don't know where to turn to. So we think that's more that social media companies can do. The most extensive set of recommendations in this report are for police and security. That's not to say that police and security haven't been willing participants at all. We have been delighted with how receptive all of the police and security services that we've spoken to have been to our work, and many of them very keen to do more to be able to help. One of the problems, though, has been a sort of disconnect between them. A lack of information exchange and the lack of ability to share information has come across. So we're making some big suggestions about how that could be improved. And probably the most major of our recommendations in this area is that we are suggesting that Operation Bridger, which, as Hannah said, is the security that exists for MPs both at Westminster and in their constituencies, is expanded in some form to local councillor level. We think that's essential to help protect those local councillors. We have a set of recommendations in here for parliaments, so that's Westminster and the devolved administrations. And this is really where we centre the work around families and around staff, which Hannah talked about. We so often see that staff are the first people to open the MP's inbox and see all of that abuse, or to be running their social media channels. In fact, Mike Freer, when he announced last week that he wasn't going to be standing again at the next election, he talked shockingly about how he had bought himself a stab vest. But I think more shockingly, he talked about how he'd bought stab vests for his staff for when they were out and about in the constituency. So we think they need protecting. We also think there is more that can be done to support families. Again, Mike Freer says that the thing that made him decide to step back was actually his husband and the impact that the abuse was having on his husband. Similarly, Mari Black, who Hannah mentioned, she talked about how it was the impact on her family that was the thing that made her decide that she was going to step back from politics. So we make a suite of suggestions there about supporting families and supporting the well-being of staff. In terms of local government, this is a cross-cutting theme through the recommendations, but there are a number of very specific things that we think can make councillors safer. Now, one of these that maybe will sound a little bit dry at first reading is about risk planning at council meetings. There's an example in the report of a deputy leader of a council who talks about how a couple of years ago, after an unpopular planning decision was passed, Hannah did talk about planning, the crowd after the meeting surged around her and they started swearing at her and pushing her. And you can sort of hear the fear in her quote when she says, "I thought I might die." So we think there's more that needs to be done to make sure that those meetings are safe for those who participate in them. It's timely that we have an election set of recommendations, as this year will be an election year. We make recommendations around things like candidate screening, but also we have recommendations here for social media companies, again, that we think they need to do more about misinformation and disinformation at election time. And there are a number of recommendations in this section that we do think, if we have a November election, we can get implemented in time for the election. Last, but absolutely no means least, we have political parties. And we think political parties have an absolutely vital role in making sure that their members adhere to good standards of behaviour. Most political parties will have a code of conduct. They are not always universally put in place in the same way, and sanctions are not always put in place if people break those codes of conduct. So we have a number of recommendations for what we think that political parties should do. So I wouldn't say I had any favourite recommendations. We think the 28 recommendations are all important to be taken as a whole. However, there are some that, when asked, we think are probably key to this work. First, you'll see one about government resourcing a central unit. One of the main things that has come across, as Hannah and I have spoken to all of these many stakeholders, is that there isn't anyone in charge, that there are lots of brilliant people working often in a voluntary capacity to do their best across police, across the Electoral Commission, but without a central force at government level who are coordinating this, keeping track on the scale of the abuse and resourcing solutions, we don't think that we'll see wholesale change. So we've called for this to be in a ministerial portfolio with a UK-wide remit. Our second one that we've pulled out here is about representatives modelling good behaviour. Now, pretty much every media interview I do, I am asked, but what about politicians? They need to behave themselves. I was asked it on Radio Essex yesterday morning, and my response was, yes, 100%. Politicians do need to show good behaviour. They need to prove to the public that they are respecting the public, but also they respect other politicians as well. So we do think that politicians have a role to play. And the second 2 points here are about political literacy. And this is the thing. I said I thought it would be social media before we started the work. It's actually political literacy that has come across as one of the really big issues. And pretty much across all of our stakeholder interviews, in some way this has been reflected, that the public don't understand what their elected representatives do. They don't understand what MPs do. They certainly don't understand what local councillors do. So that sometimes can lead to disinterest and people not turning up and voting. But it can also lead to misunderstanding. People don't understand what change is possible and how change is possible. And people also go to the wrong person. So we've heard, for example, for lots of MPs' offices who have escalations of abuse because somebody phones them because it's something that a local councillor should be dealing with. So we think that political literacy is needed on a number of levels. Absolutely at school level. We think that more needs to be done, and we join the calls for people like Shout Out UK, who I mentioned earlier on, that we need to put more political literacy in schools. But many of us are not in school anymore. So we think that there needs to be awareness for the general public. So this could, we actually haven't been very specific about this, but it could, for example, be that when your polling card comes for a local election, there is information included about who you're voting for and what their roles are and how they will help you. We think that's really vital to try and help the general public understand what their elected representatives do. So yes, as I said, I don't have any favourite recommendations, but these are the 4 that we think are absolutely central. So as I said, we launched 2 weeks ago, and we've had a brilliant response to our work so far. We've had a great media response, we've had brilliant political response, and stakeholders have been very willing to say that they are here to help and back our work. You can see some pictures here of the launch event that we had in Parliament. There are some fairly well-known faces there who have endorsed our work. And actually, we were delighted before we launched that we had 4 previous prime ministers all supported our work. So that's Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Theresa May, and David Cameron, all talked about why they think this work is so important. But the hard work starts now. We've done the easy bit, which is writing the recommendations, but now we need to push for these recommendations to be implemented. We've always said that we don't want this to be a report that just sits on a shelf. So we've got brilliant momentum. We've got stakeholders who are ready to help us. We've got politicians who show that there is political will to make change on this issue. So over the next year or so, we're really going to be pushing to make change. And if you are interested in supporting what we're doing, there are a number of ways that you could help us. Firstly, talk to people about this. I think it's still something that the general public just do not understand as being a problem. So share a copy of our report, share a link to this talk, because we really think it's something that we need to be talking about more. Secondly, if you are an elected politician or have been an elected politician, you can go to our website and endorse the recommendations. We're really trying to build up as much of a sort of groundswell of support as we can. And thirdly, if you would like to support our work, do have a look at our website and think about becoming a friend of the foundation. We can really only do this work with the support and funding that enables us to carry on with our campaigning. So please do take a look and have a think about that. And on that note, thank you.
I'll just shift here. And Karen, do you mind? Karen Wright has very kindly offered to be the mic runner. And now it's to me to always figure out how to actually work. Is it working? Aha. Sometimes it's always the second one that works. Here you go. The second one.
The one that says it's not always working. Okay.
Well, thank you both so much. And both for coming, but obviously just the broader work that you've been doing on this. It's been quite a labor, I think, but we do really appreciate it. So we'll open it up for questions. And whilst you think of questions, I will also sort of shift that, work to figure out how I see the questions online as well. Yeah, I'll stop sharing. I'll turn the screens off because that tends to help make things work better. Right, questions.
John Curtis, University of Strathclyde. This is going to be a critical question, but it's designed in a sense to get you to say a bit more. You talk a great deal about how abuse, etc., is now more widespread. But I guess somebody might say to you, well, why do you think this is happening? And doesn't any set of recommendations need to be rooted in an understanding of what are the causes of these things? And that perhaps at the moment, is there not a risk that what you're seeking is a lot of measures that mitigate the abuse that exists, rather than trying to reduce the incidence of abuse in the first place?
Thank you for the question. No, it's a really important question. And there is, yeah, my other hat is a PhD student, and I'm always like, what are the causes and the research around that? It's an issue that has been researched only like in kind of stable democracies only relatively recently. And I think we are kind of still trying to figure out what the causes are. The kind of research that's out there so far suggests that social media is part of the problem, even if it's not always how it manifests. So the misinformation, disinformation on social media, that is part of the problem. So that's one of the reasons we have those recommendations for social media companies. Though, as we kept saying, it's not just a social media problem. There seems to be a lot of different reasons for it. A lot of people talk about the kind of increase in kind of divisions, partly because of the various referendums we've had, or like the divisions that, you know, were kind of in context of that. I guess what I'm saying is it's a complex problem with a lot of different causes, but I take your point that we need to understand the causes. And I think we did, you know, do research, in my kind of academic background fed into that. So with, I guess the recommendations are evidence-based, but I take your point that we need to do more research, and we're at university. So if anyone wants to kind of do a master's thesis or join me doing academic work to figure more about the causes, we'd welcome that as well. Do you want to add anything?
I mean, I would also say that for us, it became clear that we were going to have to make suggestions that would try and alleviate the issue for those who are currently serving, as well as digging down to those root causes. So that's really for things like political literacy. We think that's really important, but it's going to take longer to see that come through as actually changing the situation. But we also wanted to have things that were going to, in the short term, stop this sort of the number of people who are currently stepping away from politics. So that was, I think, really important. And I think slightly related to this, the statistic that we haven't shared, but was probably one of the most shocking things that I came across when we were doing this research. And that was some research that the Electoral Commission did after the May elections last year. And they were testing public sentiment about the issue of abuse and intimidation. So they asked a number of questions like, do you think it's all right to basically take the mickey out of an MP on social media? And the sort of the escalation of that was, do you think it's acceptable to threaten an MP in the street? And what was most stark was the age range of the responses, that anyone over the age of 45, only about 3% of them thought that it was acceptable. But for the 18 to 24-year-olds, 16% of them thought that that was acceptable. So for us, I think, even if we don't have all of the solutions yet, I think it showed that it's really necessary to act and try and start making change now, because we can't allow that to kind of carry on developing, that younger people think that this is behavior that's acceptable.
Behind you, and then
you touched on the different sort of experiences that people had with police in different parts of the country, and you talked about the new bill that's come in, or the new legislation. And is there something about there is no consequences for these things, and that, you know, for misinformation or for almost inciting people to be abusive and to, you know, pile-ons on social media and things like that? I just wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's interesting. There are a lot of different opinions about, you know, what if any kind of new legislation we need, or if there we need to be more creative with the legislation that we have. So there are many examples of people who have been kind of punished through existing law, like the malicious communications legislation, and, you know, like harassment legislation. So there is existing legislation that people have been punished for, but the Online Safety Act, not harms. It used to be online harms. Online Safety Act does bring some of that in, though there are different opinions about how, if it goes far enough, if it goes too far. So I guess my answer to your question is yes, but there are existing sanctions that are available now, but there might be more needed as well. And it really depends who you ask. Some people think that we need lots more legislation. Some people think we just need to be more creative with what we have. So it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and I think on the flip side of that, one of the things that we found from talking to people like the Operation Bridger folks was that they sometimes have a hard time persuading politicians to take crimes through to prosecution, because they don't want to be seen to be prosecuting their constituents. That actually there have been a number of very successful prosecutions, and that was one of the things that they fed into us, that they would like that to be more public about actually when there can be good outcomes for people who have committed offences.
And I guess just something that was really interesting that Operation Bushra said, but also a lot of elected representatives, is when, they get a kind of they get a death threat, for example, and they report it, then the police go to the person who sent the death threat, and the person's like, oh, I had no idea, like I committed a crime. I was just really angry and I didn't realize the impact that would have had. So I think that there might be a lack of understanding that, sending a death threat is already a crime. But people don't realize that, one, it's a crime, and two, that it can be really impactful. And that's something I was talking about the normalization. Like, one mean tweet might not be that impactful, but if you get like 100 on your phone and you're sitting at home, that is very impactful, and then your staff have to read it. So I think that is something, again, that people don't always realize the impact that it has. Yeah, just add that.
I guess, well, you hand over the microphone, I guess I would say, also, a lot of elected officials are living alone for a period of time in London or Hollywood or.
And that's the thing with the families as well. So like, if the abuse is directed in their constituent and their families, just their families, or the MP isn't there, but then if it's directed, they're on their phone by themselves. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that support's not necessarily there.
Yeah, I'm Hannah Graham, a criminologist with a strong interest in Scottish politics. I'm interested in hearing more about these strategies on political literacy. Our experiences in Scotland would suggest that some of the most abusive and intimidatory behaviours that we see in some cases are people who understand the political system quite well. They just happen to have very hyper-partisan views, and then they are not rightly characterised as Zoomery, conspiracy theory believing. There is that group. There certainly is that group where we think, gosh, a lot of education is in order. But there's particularly men who will not only target our politicians, they will target the judiciary whose decisions they don't like, particularly if the case involves constitutional implications or contempt of court and a male blogger has then written about it. They will target academics that they don't like. So, I will get spoken about in terms of my own rape or the rape of the children that I don't have when I say views that they don't like. But these people that are in certain groups have very good understandings of constitutional politics, party politics, registers of interest, and so on. So it's not so much a case of at the school level or visiting educational institutions, but a very knowing intimidation and abuse that relates to male violence and behaviours that are harmful as well as illegal. So is there a multifaceted political literacy strategy for the people who know exactly what they're doing and are not a small group when they've researched you and they spend their time targeting our elected representatives?
I actually don't think we've particularly considered that. So I think that's a really helpful comment. I think that's something we've always said with this report, we will not have all of the answers. So I think that's just something that's really interesting to hear your feedback on, that we'll take away and think about. So thank you.
And I guess in terms of the literacy point, when we talked to Shout Out, we had put initially like political literacy, but they said, no, you have to put like political and media literacy. And then, you could also add like literacy in terms of gender and inequalities, like that kind of, it's all kind of related. And, the Andrew Tate effect in terms of online abuse and views that, I guess that's talking particularly in schools, but it is a lot of, not just young boys as well. But I think these issues are all linked, right? So yeah, it's important for us to think about as well.
I think on that, there's several things that you said that I just sort of find shocking. So the fact that you said that somebody said, oh, I didn't realize sending a death threat was,
Lots of,
and so I think that goes to the sort of, this isn't young people necessarily, it's people who you think should know better.
Well, and I think as well, like I think your question, and kind of are the people we talked about, like, oh, people didn't realize that what they had done to me was so bad. There is, I guess, a spectrum of people who are perpetrating, and some know exactly what they're doing and some don't, so, and then the causes, that's why it's so complicated, because that's probably there are probably different causes for those groups. So very complicated, and we need more research. So
Hi, I'm Kes Dugdale from the John Smith Centre. I'm a former politician that's married to a current politician, and I can tell you so much of this report rings true to me as somebody who has a panic alarm in her bedroom and a house surrounded by cameras paid for by the taxpayer because of threats that we've had to our family over the years. So I commend you for this incredibly important bit of work. I wanted to follow on from John's comment and offer my own analysis of the situation, which is I think we live in a country which is more divided and angrier than it has been in recent times. But that on top of that, we have social media, which for me is an enabling tool and a convening tool that almost gives more people an equal power to use their voice in an angry and divisive way, that we have to have a broader conversation about the role of social media in our political discourse. But it's also being exploited by populists and quite often populist politicians who use emotional language rather than rational language to argue their case. I don't think the two of you and the wonderful team that you have can get rid of misogyny and populism from our political discourse in this country or across the globe. But I'm very grateful to you for the work that you are doing, putting forward a platform of substantive things that we can do with the power that we have to make things a bit better. My question, and I promise I have one, Karen, is do you ever worry about, in talking about how hellish it is, that you're putting off the very people that we need to step up and step forward into our political life? And if so, what can we do to support you in addressing that?
Yes. It's always been a balancing act for us when we've been doing this work, that we want to make it clear what the problem is without putting people off. And I was really struck when Virginia Crosby, the MP for Anglesey, last year, she talked about wearing a stab vest. She was one of the first politicians, I think, to talk publicly about it. And in this one interview, she said, yes, I wear a stab vest, but it's the most wonderful job in the world. So it was that balance of her really feeling that she had to continue doing the job because she felt she was doing the right thing and she liked her job, but also that she was balancing the lack of safety that she felt. So I think that is quite challenging. And I was on, as I said, I was on BBC Essex yesterday morning, and the topic of the announcer was like, we're talking today about, is it just too dangerous to be an MP? And I was sort of thinking in my head, if I'm asked that question directly, how am I going to phrase it? Because absolutely what we don't want to do is put people off getting involved in politics. But we just want to be clear about what that risk is and how we can try and make a difference. And, you know, we work with some of the brilliant organisations out there who are working to empower women into politics, like Elect Her, for example. They're fabulous. And some of the work that they do is about preparing people, preparing women for what will happen when they get into politics. So it's not about putting them off, but it's about making sure they have that toolkit for understanding what they're going to have to deal with if they do get elected.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think it is a balance between, you want people to be aware, but we don't want to put people off. And I think it is about that support, and our recommendations are, you know, about implementing support to mitigate what is happening. And there are already fantastic organizations doing so much work to encourage people to go into office and understanding, you know, the current reality of that. Yeah, so yes, but we still want a diverse range of people to run and be in office.
You had your hand up at one point in time, didn't you?
Hi, I'm Stephanie Rea from University of Strathclyde. Yeah, my questions were very much related to what's already been asked, but maybe to just follow up a little bit. I was also mostly interested in the perpetrators and the people who do this to politicians. And you've already talked a little bit about that it's more younger people. Yeah, and then we've heard some other contributions as well about what kind of groups might be portraying that behavior. Basically, you also talked about codes of conducts within parties. So I'm quite interested in the extent to which you think or you know that that behavior is coming from party members, and what parties' maybe initiatives or experiences have been and maybe directly engaging with their members. And another question I had was, and I don't know if you have done any research on this, but internationally, do you have a sense of how grave the problem is in the UK compared to other countries in Europe and beyond?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Evidence suggests globally and in the UK that a lot of the abuse, particularly towards women elected representatives, comes from party members. And that's one of the reasons why we have recommendations for political parties. And it can sound kind of ironic. You think that, you know, if you're in the same party, you shouldn't abuse your fellow party members, but that is a really, really big problem. And it's not one party's problem. This happens across the political parties. And it comes from other elected officials as well. So it's not just that people are getting intimidated by people, they like faceless people on social media, like often they know them. And particularly, you know, MPs talk about going to their party meetings, and that's, you know, that can be a really, really scary place to be depending on what's going on. And that is the fact that happens in political parties is kind of that happens around the world. In terms of prevalence, in terms of there has been quite a lot of research on this. It depends like how you're measuring it, and that's something that's really interesting because the research is in like kind of stable democracies is fairly new. There's lots of different ways to measure it. But in terms of online abuse, the UK seems to be pretty bad in terms of MPs in particular. There's been a lot of studies on doing Twitter abuse or X abuse towards MPs, and UK MPs seem to get it a lot. And it comes internationally as well. So and this is about the cause as well. So you have someone, you know, your party member, but then you have a faceless person who lives across the world abusing you. So it is a diverse, complicated problem. Yeah. Oh, codes of conduct. All the main parties have them. All of the parties don't apply them that well as well. And I think they would all perhaps say that. We've heard from people in all different parties that they're just not applied as well. And partly that is that sanctions are unclear, or they're not applied. So that is something that we can call to strengthen. And that should be implementable because they have the infrastructure in place. And a lot of them have had codes of conduct for a long time. And a lot of them revised their codes of conduct around Me Too movements in 2017 and 2018. So they do exist, and a lot of the parties have taken action on this, and that is something that they are committed to improving. And it's something that is one of those, hopefully it should be implementable because it is happening, there is infrastructure there. And it is really important because evidence indicates that it is a problem within the political parties. Yeah, talked a lot. Do you have anything to add?
I don't.
Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm Christopher Hand from the University of Glasgow, and a lot of our cyber abuse research has looked at bystander perceptions. And one of the things that comes through quite compellingly is even when participant bystanders recognise severity in the incidents of the abuse, there still is often a willingness to blame the victim.
Mm-hmm.
This is often related to things like dark personality characteristics, actually belief in a just world, you know, good things happen to bad people, all these things. But I wondered, in your preparation for the document, how much about victim blaming came through? So someone already mentioned about, you know, reporting to police and you know, was there hesitancy to do that in case people would be victimized or you know, blamed for their own abuse? So yeah, my question's around what are the stories of victim blaming from the stakeholders that you've spoken to?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I'm not sure if this is necessary. Well, maybe it's a bit of victim blaming. Something that seems to happen quite a lot is when elected representatives, you know, report to, and this can be the police to their local council, to, you know, parties, you know, it can be at various levels. Sometimes they're told, well, that's just part of the job. Like, what did you expect? And that's what I mean, like the normalization part of it. So it's not quite victim blaming, but it, you know, it is, yeah. So it's like, well, what did you expect? So that is something that came up quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's linked to that normalization point. It's that, you know, oh, you've chosen to be a local councillor, you should have a thick skin. So it's also linked to there are some recommendations in here that might sound quite obvious, but having written levels of abuse that should be reported to the police. There are a number of occasions that doesn't exist. So actually, I don't think people understand when they are necessarily being a victim. So one of the things that we're calling for is that to be more strictly laid out, that you understand what has to be reported, what's a crime, what's the nature of the escalation, so people can really understand that the things that are happening to them are not just, oh, something I should put up with because it's part of the job.
And something we find interesting as well, so I talked about how some perpetrators don't realize, you know, what they did was criminal or had impact. It seems that some elected representatives kind of diminish what they're experiencing. So they're like, oh, I haven't experienced abuse myself. I see it all the time. I mean, someone spat on me once and like I get a death threat every so often, but I don't experience it. And and we were like, what? So that, again, it comes back to the normalization point. So that kind of, oh, well, this is something I just have to put up with. Yeah, and that's something that obviously we think is unacceptable and should change. But that is a bit of a kind of culture change. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Emer. I'm a postgraduate student here at the University of Glasgow. Firstly, thank you so much for your talk and for your work to kind of raise awareness of this issue. I just want to ask, following on from kind of you talking about how it's so normalised and kind of so almost widespread across politics, how have you found the response from policymakers? Do you find there's any kind of hesitation to implement these recommendations based on perhaps kind of pessimistic notion that it's almost so bad, it's just the way it is, it's not going to change? Or have you found that people are actually quite optimistic and think, no, like we can really change how things are?
We're only 2 weeks from launch, so we haven't had that much time to sense check the enthusiasm. But I think the one thing that I think benefits the fact that we're an independent charity who've chosen to take on this work, that I hadn't really realised until quite recently, is that politicians are reluctant to talk about this because they don't want to be seen to calling on people to feel sorry for them. That actually it's not top of the agenda because there are so many other things in the world that need fixing. So therefore, if you're an MP, you don't want to be the person who stands up and talks about this. So I think that that is probably the biggest issue that we will come up against, that with so many other things that that have to be changed, why should this be one of them? Which is why I think it's been quite interesting that Mike Freer, after he announced last week that he's stepping down, he's spoken so widely about it. And we haven't been in touch with him yet, but I would like to chat with him about whether that's been a very active decision, that he has been doing the media rounds and then some, so that he's seen it as his role to really kind of highlight the issue. But I think that is going to be the main stumbling block. But given the amount of positive reception we've had so far, I'm hoping that's something we'll be able to get past.
Thank you.
Nicola McKeown, I'm Director of the Centre for Public Policy, and actually my question follows on really nicely from that. I think the work you're doing is brilliant, really, really important, and congratulations on the report. The recommendations are really interesting. One question I was going to raise was about the recommendation of bringing all of this together in a ministerial portfolio, which I completely understand the desire to bring it all together. I'm a little bit skeptical of doing that within a cabinet portfolio, not least because the minister in question may be part of the broader normalization of some of this in political debate. And I wondered if you'd thought about a legislative route of, you know, almost like a safety in public life bill that introduced statutory duties to protect. And I totally get the politicians not wanting to draw attention to themselves, but it's not just politicians. It is judges, it is officials sometimes, it's people in public life, and broadening it out to public service and the duty to protect. And, you know, I'm not quite sure who would then look after that duty, some sort of regulatory body perhaps, but I'm just skeptical of it being a ministerial responsibility.
No, I can understand the skepticism, and it was something we thought long and hard about. I think it came across as that the definite need for somebody to be pulling all of this together. And I think quite a lot of the things that we think that role or that department should have are around resource around trying to get a better sense of the scope of the issue, like the size of the issue. Like, we know it's very bad, but nobody is currently doing full research about the extent of it. So that was really where we came to, was that it was the best way to try and see if it worked. But yes, as I said, I can understand that your skepticism, and it may not be the ideal solution, but it was the best one that we came to.
I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to jump in.
There's there's one online.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to look at that one? Well, it's quite
Do you want me
long,
to
so
read-
I'll let
to
you.
read it? Should I read it out?
Well, I can read it.
Okay.
after. So it's quite long. I can see a very clear role for community organizers who support people to the analysis of power in their communities, and organizations offering adult learning, WEA, and universities in political awareness education. There was an excellent program of active learning for active citizenship nationally, which I developed courses designed to take people from their own interests, their rights, to who speaks for them and how to influence public decisions. It increased people's understanding of government structures and politicians' roles, and led to some people choosing to stand for elections. So, question. What hope do you have for investment in this kind of work again? So an extent back to the political literacy sort of question towards adults.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we've kept the political literacy points reasonably broad, and it's certainly, we're not political literacy experts, and we haven't said that we are. So we want to work with other organizations who are doing good work in this area, for example, like Shout Out. So I don't know the direct answer to that question, but yes, I think working with others who've already found solutions and ways of working, I think is really important.
And I think that, as Sue said in the presentation, that's something that's important for this. Like, we're not going to solve this by ourselves. Like, it is about collaborating with experts. That's the only way we're going to kind of implement the recommendations and find new solutions as well.
So I'd like to come in towards the end here and raise a question that I suspect might be on many minds. So you alluded to the fact that it could be an election year. Now, going back to sort of John's initial question, there's some sort of short term and there's some long term. Obviously, you're talking about more short term provisions. You mentioned the pledge, but beyond saying, hey guys, let's be a little bit nicer as candidates, what other recommendations, or how does this feed into the general election? Can you give us some insights as to what your strategy is to try to improve general election?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the recommendations that we think are possible to be implemented in time for an election are not the real biggies. They're going to take a bit more time. There are more recommendations in there that are going to improve what's happening for the candidates. I think that's the area that we can see the biggest difference ahead of the next election around, for example, the Electoral Commission have a recommendation in there about improving the social media guidance that they give to candidates. So that might feel like a small thing, but actually if you're equipping those candidates with the skills to know how to deal better with abuse and with mis and disinformation, I think that's going to be really helpful. So I think it is those smaller things that we think we're going to be able to make change on. But those, even though they're smaller, they're not unimportant.
And there is a recommendation in there that it has been announced that it's happening, but I don't think it's been implemented yet, or announced that there will be security will be an exemption in election spending. And that would be, that's really important if you're getting, if you need more protection because you're getting lots of threats. So that is something that would be very practical. And that's one of those hopefully quick wins, because there is plans to do it. We just would push for that to happen before this election. Yeah.
Fantastic, great. I think that is drawing us toward an end. Before we thank Sue and Hannah, just to point out again that the next Stevenson talk is scheduled for the 12th of March. If you want to hear about me ramble on about US elections, please do come along for that. As John always makes me do one of these around this time of year, so that's my standing up to John obligation here. So with that, can we thank Sue and Hannah? Thank you so much for coming, and thanks for giving us. Thank you, everyone. Right, and thank you, everybody who is still online. We'll end the thing now. I can remember how to do this.